Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this day for this webinar. Um, we are working on issues that are very much in the news, and I'm feeling that today. I think the panelists are as well, as we are all juggling sort of various aspects of our identities and what's happening in the world. There was a point this morning where I had the split screen up of trying to understand this terrible Supreme Court decision on the one hand with the New York Times, while Haaretz was up right next to it, and I was trying to follow um, the latest news about um, missile attacks and whether or not President Trump is looking to get into this war. On the other hand, there was a moment I just sort of didn't know where I should be looking. Um, I think a lot of us are feeling that today. Um, uh, for folks who are on the NGN list, we also just a little while before this webinar started, we sent out an action alert dealing with efforts in Congress to stop President Trump from entering the war by attacking Iran with American forces without Congress's approval. Um, I don't need to say a lot more about that, but I would say please, please, please check your inbox for that opportunity. Um, so this is an emotionally difficult moment, I think, for a lot of us. Who are focused on Israel and peace in particular. And I will share that I had the experience, on Thursday night or Friday morning, as it sort of really came to understand that that Israel was in a sort of new type of war with Iran. I asked myself whether or not it made sense to continue this webinar, which is on a different topic. I very quickly said to myself, yes, we should. We should because, and I think I wrote this in my initial email inviting people to this webinar, pride is something that needs to always happen. We need to, especially because we're talking about communities that are so often erased and ignored or shamed, that we need to create the space to say, no, this doesn't go on pause. This always happens. Um, and so I do want to have this conversation. But I think conversation is not sort of, I don't know if there's a normal celebratory pride conversation. I think we're here to talk about some tensions and some difficult issues that many of us experience as progressive Jewish activists um, uh, within the LGBT community. That's the focus of our conversation, but I think things that we also feel elsewhere sometimes, especially in the last almost 2 years since October 7th. So I'm excited to have these two panelists with us. They are people who I admire tremendously. They are people who I think of as trailblazers, more than trailblazers, they're field blazers. They're people who have built spaces um, where people could come and be authentically who they are in terms of their sexual orientation and gender identity, but also show up in those spaces as Jews and be Jews with those sexual orientation, gender identity, and be comfortable and create that space within other spaces in the Jewish community. Um, and so I'm not going to go through the full bios, but I will just say, be remiss if I didn't say anything. So Idit Klein is the longtime president and CEO of Keshet, the National Organization for LGBTQ Equality in Jewish Life. And Rabbi Amichai Lau Levi is a spiritual leader of the Lab Shul community in New York, the creator of storytelling, and I think very excitingly, he's the subject of a documentary that is now on tour called Sabbath Queen. So thank you for both of you for being here for this conversation. I want to start, and I'm going to call maybe on Idit first, but I think each of the three of us has some aspect of hyphenated Israeli-American experience. And I want to start again because these are not normal times to check in with each of you and how you're experiencing what's been happening the last week, and all the ways that our lives and those aspects of our identity are different, maybe even as a result of the last 2 years.
Sure. Thank you so much, Noam, and to everyone at the New Jewish Narrative for inviting Amichai and I to speak together today. Am I right, Amichai, that this is our first panel somehow in all these years?
Just the two of us?
Just the two of
With
us.
Noah, maybe.
I think so. So I just have to say that in and of itself is very special. Amichai and I met back in 2003 when we both were part of a fellowship for young Jewish social entrepreneurs back when we were young, called the Joshua Venture Fellowship. And I feel like we have kind of really grown up professionally and creatively and as leaders in the Jewish world and beyond. And I'm actually leaving my position at Keshet at the end of July, so it's particularly just poignant to be here in conversation with you, Amichai. So thank you, Noam, and everyone at NJN. So this moment in the last 2 years, so I'm someone who started out my life in Israel, came to the States as a toddler with parents who planned to be here for 3 months, and everyone knows how that goes. They remain here 50 years later. I went back to Israel as an adult, lived there for a while, then came back planning to be here for 3 months. I'm not joking, and remain here over 20 years later. So, and Israel is very deep in my heart and in the deepest part of my heart, and it's much more than a hyphenated identity. And I would say that the last 2 years have been without a doubt the hardest years of my life, the hardest years in which I've led my organization. It's been a time of kind of a more of a sense of vulnerability than I would have anticipated feeling. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors on both sides, and that's something I knew about from a very young age, and it was very present for me. And yet, it always felt very far back somehow, even as it was very alive in the lives of each of my grandparents and every other older person in my family. And for whatever reason, around November, December 2023 was the first time that I did the calculation that I was born in 1972. And that was 27 years after my grandparents and many others in my family crawled out of concentration camps in 1945. And suddenly that proximity time-wise felt very frightening in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And it felt significant. And then, of course, the last week has also, been deeply terrifying, in some ways in a different way than other times. And I actually have one cousin who was injured in a missile attack. Thankfully, it looks like she will be okay. And so, it has felt very close to home in many, many ways.
Mm. Boy, Idit, sorry to hear about your cousin. And I'll pick up where you left off, somewhere between the hyphenated and the blurry sense of what's home. I was born in Israel. I've been living in New York since '98. I'm on the back and forth route. Certainly, this last almost 2 years. I came back from Berlin last night, where we just screened Sabbath Queen, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And was about to go back to Israel on Sunday, this coming Sunday, that right now is not happening. Um, these are for sure the most perplexing and painful times this past week, even more so. Um, I'm going to quote my 96-year-old mother living in Jerusalem, who shortly after October 7th and in the many months since, and even just this week, when I'd call her, when I'd visit, she'd say, this is like if you're in the hospital, you're with somebody in the emergency room, and that's all there is. And then you just step outside to the lobby or to the street, and people are just walking around minding their own business, and they don't know that you're with somebody in the emergency room. And she was talking about what it's like for her to be in Jerusalem this last many, many years, but these last months. And it feels like here in New York today, we celebrated my oldest daughter's high school graduation, right? Here's this beautiful queer achievement and human achievement and beautiful celebration. And I'm on my phone, like, how's everybody in the shelters? What's going on? I have people in Gaza. I have friends from Iran. I have my mother and siblings and nephews and nieces in shelters. I have friends in hospital. The split screen multiple realities of being in the emergency room and the rest of the world marches on is extremely jarring, I would say. And um, when you call my mother and ask her, how are you? She says, accordingly. That's become her answer. So I'm adopting accordingly, which is a very nice way of saying WTF.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I will, maybe as a way of segue, share that my son a year ago graduated from middle school. He was attended a Jewish middle school, and they had an eighth grade trip to Israel. That was big, big event that they look forward to for years. Um, and it was just after April of, I guess, 2024, when there was a attack of missiles from Iran, that the school decided to cancel that trip. And I remember texting with some of my relatives saying, he won't be coming after all, so you won't get to take him out to dinner. And I was surprised that two of my aunts independently wrote me back to say, it's okay, it's better this way. This is not the time. And I'd never heard that from my family in Israel. And the answer in the past, whenever things were difficult, was like, it's okay, we'll get through it. It's not as bad as it looks on the news. That's what I used to hear. Life goes on. And I think the reality is that life does go on, even at times when things are so bad that it's better, if a 13-year-old, 14-year-old boy doesn't come visit. Um, so I want to channel that spirit and say, as bad as things are now, life does go on. And I want to say queer life goes on. And so I want to point us in that direction of the conversation. And I want to take a moment to start out very broadly and invite you, and again, we'll start with Idit, to talk about, what it is that those of us who are allies to the community, Jewish progressive allies who may or may not be involved, like, what are some of the things that we need to know? What are some of the things that we need to think about?
Thank you for that question. I'd say the primary thing, and I feel like I've been on repeat with this for my 24 plus years at Keshet, is make sure that everybody knows that you are an ally, what that means to you, how you express it, how that makes you show up in the world, and then do it again and again and again, because people don't assume that you are. I mean, we have had, and we've really learned this from kids. Keshet does a lot of work with LGBTQ Jewish teens, and we've had Jewish teens from, I won't name them, but the most liberal synagogues in New York City and San Francisco, who talk about how their rabbis aren't supportive. And I know their rabbis, are deeply committed allies, but they're not saying it enough or in the right places. And so, we have always been an insistent voice, to rabbis and heads of day schools and youth movements and JCCs and federations, and all different types of Jewish institutions. And we've been especially insistent since the new administration. And I'd say on this devastating day of the Scarmetti decision, even more profoundly insistent today, that leaders remember not to assume that anyone knows how you feel and think unless you say it. And what you need to say is, no matter what you may hear from the highest court of the land, no matter what you may hear from the Oval Office, no matter what you may hear from your state government, know that here in your Jewish community, we will stand by you and we will never ever stop fighting for you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Amichai, it makes me think, my professional experience as an LGBTQ world was an advocacy in corporate spaces and versus, vis-a-vis corporate DEI practices, and just how powerful it is to say, I'm so glad you're here to somebody when they step up and show up. Uh, that's coming back to me. Amichai, do you have anything to add?
There's much to add, obviously. Idit, thank you for that and for the reminder that we can't assume that we know how to show up for each other, especially now, where there are so many signs and symbols, slogans and hashtags, articles of clothing and identity that alienate us from each other. And the reminder that I try and hold and I try to remind us and each other is that there is more that we share in common than that which divides us. And despite the glaring optics of immediate polarities, especially within the Jewish community, the patience, the respect to sit and say, look, you're saying this, you're wearing that, you're feeling this, you're protesting that. Can we sit down and see what do we share in common before we get down into the divides that are profound and important and should not be shaken off? I would say within the Jewish community that is lacking, and within the queer community that is lacking, within the world that is lacking. And a lot of the pain that we are seeing right now of so many divisions is because we assume and we don't take the time to invest in what does ally look like, or what does just common denominator look like beyond the reasonable divides. That's my little recipe for reducing some of the toxicity and tension.
Yeah, thank you. Amichai, you wrote a New York Times op-ed about a year ago, and in it you told the story of how a Star of David, or was an Israeli flag, um, was received by some people at that event, and how that, what you drew out of that, and what happened with that. Could you share that story with us?
Sure. No, that was an op-ed I wrote for the Times a year ago for World Pride, in which I wrote about why I won't be marching in last year's Pride in New York, because it became two different prides. One that is like the traditional pride with what to me seemed like a pro-Israel only position with very little nuance for being pro the people of Israel and the state, but not the government, as opposed to the Liberation March that I helped create back in 2016, that is for sure anti-Zionists, and one could argue to an extent anti-Semitic, but for sure me and other people in my community and vicinity did not feel welcome or safe to be there. My choice was to do neither. And I proposed, as I just did, to have dinner parties and to have heart circles and to maybe get off the public square of big titles for a moment and hurts and find places for connection and for curiosity about our differences and for healing in a proud space. And one of the examples I used was one of a decade ago, where I was walking down Fifth Avenue with one of the children that I'm lucky to be part of their queer family structure. And there was a small Israeli flag on the avenue from one of the synagogues who marched before us in much more innocent days. And my 3-year-old at the time kid grabbed the Israeli flag with gusto and began waving it down Fifth Avenue. And there were hisses and there were boos. This is around 2014, whatever that summer was. There was already some interactions between Gaza and Israel. And I remember he didn't notice, but I did. It was on my shoulders, and I was trying to coax him to trade the rainbow flag for the Israeli flag. And at some point, I succeeded, and He has no recollection of this, but I remember walking down Fifth Avenue as a proud gay Israeli Jewish rabbi man, fighting for human rights, fighting for queer rights in so many ways, and clocking this real sense of feeling not safety compromised for a moment, but the blurriness of identity in a way that felt again, not dangerous, but compromising. It was a crack. And in the 10 years and plus since, this crack has widened into, in some cases, full-on break. And in some cases, I believe it can be glued together. And in some cases, perhaps at least right now, not.
Yeah. I invited you down to tell that story because I think it connects with what you were saying, a moment before, right? That we have these symbols and we assume we know what they mean, um, but maybe we think they mean different things, and see them differently. And that, again, the place to, part of the answer, part of the antidote, part of the place to start is, as you were saying, start with by having conversation about what unites us before we get into those symbols and those divisions, that are also very important. And I think sort of I assume the way that Israeli flag was interpreted, um, by different people there is an example of a symbol being divisive before we look to the commonalities. Uh, a note of housekeeping before I move us forward. I neglected to say at the beginning, that we do want your questions. Please, please, please put them into the Q&A. I see that we have one now. We'll keep going through this conversation, but I'll be pulling those questions out throughout, and have this be more of an interactive experience. Idit, I want to turn to you to sort of be the first to sort of talk about, another aspect of what makes Israel-Palestine issues so complicated in the LGBT community, and that is pinkwashing. Will you take a moment to talk to us about what pinkwashing is, and what your experience of it is? How do we recognize both genuine LGBTQ progress in Israel while at the same time resisting, the way it can be used to kind of sweep the occupation under the rug?
Of course, I'd be glad to talk about this, but
Yeah.
just a question: are we returning to Pride, or are we done with Pride now? Just because if we're not, I wanted to comment on
Please comment.
question.
We're going to end up running out of time with everything that I want to talk
Okay.
about. So
Yeah, I mean, I want to say some things that I think are relevant, and hopefully we'll get to pinkwashing, not to the action, but to the discussion. So Pride has been very fraught. I think obviously for me and all of us at Keshet as well. And last year, it was last year, not before, unlike Amichai's stories, but it was really last year that in a big way, people were really anxious about Pride. And we had a lot, I mean, there was a point at which our phone in our national office and our offices around the country were really ringing off the hook with people calling to ask us, queer Jews calling to say, is it safe for me to march in Pride? And we had internal, very hard conversations amongst our senior staff, and brought in some board members asking the question, is it responsible for us to march in Pride? Are we endangering our staff? Are we endangering our members? And in the end, we decided that we didn't want to hide, not as Jews, not as queer people, not as queer Jews. And so we embarked on this project we hadn't anticipated of reaching out to the organizers in the 17 cities and towns where we plan to have a Pride presence, to tell them what we were feeling and what queer Jews were feeling. For some, this was surprising. These were almost all non-Jews, but there were some Jews. And for some, this was not surprising at all. For all of them, and I found this remarkable at the time, and I'd say the more time passes, the more remarkable I find it that to a person, every single Pride organizer, some paid, some volunteers, responded to our approaching them saying, queer Jews are afraid. Here are some thoughts for what you can do as the person responsible for the culture and for security at your Pride parade, march, festival that would make it more likely for Jews to feel and be safe. And to a person, every organizer responded with thank you and with receptivity and a commitment to implement those recommendations. So that's the first thing. The second real story I want to tell, not because it's the only such story that happened, but because, I mean, it's over a year, and every time I remember it, I can reconnect with hope. And so to the extent that anyone else has that response, I want to share it, because God knows we all need to reconnect with hope right now as much as we can. So it was during this Pride season of a lot of anxiety and fear around queer Jewish presence at Pride. And this happened at Miami Pride. Our contingent showed up to line up for the march, and right in front of us was the contingent from Equality Florida, the state LGBTQ rights organization in Florida, with whom we had and continue to work very closely together as part of a coalition to help defeat a surprising number of anti-LGBTQ bills in Florida. So people we knew well, and I think that's really key. And before the parade started, one of their senior people approached our lead Florida staff member and said, you know, I'm sorry, there are dogs here. I said, sorry, I know that this past period has been really rough for a lot of people in the Jewish community. And I know that people in your community might be feeling vulnerable today. So please know, and please remember, and please tell everyone in your contingent that if things heat up today, you can merge in our contingent into our contingent at any point, and we promise we will surround you. I mean, I didn't cry now, but I often actually cry when I tell this story, because it's just this act of seeing us. Now I'm crying, seeing us and seeing the vulnerability that is very real, and seeing the impact that it can make for an ally at this point to Jews to say, I see where you are and I'm going to stand with you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Like, right, that's the spirit of Pride. Like, it's that radical inclusion, to borrow a term. All right, there was a question here, a quick follow-up, Idit, about how safety was defined in the conversations that you were having at Keshet.
We were really focused on physical safety. Let's say physical safety and sort of the kind of setting a low bar, honestly, for psychological safety, because we knew that anyone who showed up at Pride in the spring of 2024 or 2025 was opening themselves up potentially to harassment or to, shouts, curses, signs that would make them feel like they were being personally attacked for another government's actions. And so there's an inherent vulnerability there that we knew anyone coming was deciding to take on. And so we were really thinking, first and foremost about physical safety, God forbid anyone be physically harmed, and then thinking about how to ensure to the best of our ability that people would not be viciously verbally harassed. And it's sad that those were the bars, but those were the bars.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I want to get back to talking about pinkwashing as this other aspect of the reality. Amichai, maybe I'll invite you to sort of talk about this first.
Oy, what can we say? There are so many layers here. I am reminded of the moment in December 2022 when the current Netanyahu government was sworn in. And we didn't know how bad it will be, but we assumed it would. And I was in Jerusalem and I was protesting with a whole group of friends in front of the Knesset. There were many, many LGBTQ activists and signs and rainbow flags, many activists. This is before the judicial reform protest. This is obviously before all that we're dealing with now. But there were racists in that government from Ben Gvir and onwards, and we knew that misogyny, homophobia, occupation, etc., was at the forefront of this government. And so we protested loudly with fear for democracy, and it felt like the right thing to do. And we were angry and a little scared. And a couple of hours later, I drove away from there and I listened on the radio to the inauguration speech of the first openly gay speaker of the Knesset, Amir Ohana, who thanked his husband and made a blessing. You know, Shecheyan, when I assumed all the Haredim there, they'll probably have to say Amen. And I was sobbing because here I am so damn proud that there's an openly gay man in the Knesset. And I didn't know how low he and others would go in the abuse of human rights and the despicable behavior that is tearing our country and region apart. So the combination of utter pride at Israel's progress, at the queer community that I'm part of in Israel, the amazing initiatives left and right. I'm involved with IGI, the Israeli Gay Youth, that has 60 chapters that is dealing with anything from young people coming out in the Arab sector and the ultra-Orthodox sector and in Tel Aviv and throughout the country. With Chavruta, the organization that helps young religious folks in the LGBTQ world come out and stay religious. None of that existed when I was growing up. So much progress, so much beautiful community work, so much pride. And at the same time, utter shame. And my political views right here that's not about that. But as an Israeli, I'm deeply ashamed of where we are, of what we're doing. And I know that for many Jews in the world right now, the attempt to hold both ends is just really difficult because Israel is waving the progress flag and is hiding, deprioritizing, dismantling any protest that includes the shameful part about how within the country and of course what is happening in Gaza, whatever is happening now in Tehran. So I'm feeling that this narrative of pinkwashing, of using the best in Israeli pride to silence some of the worst in what's happening in the society right now, is tearing many of us apart. And this is way beyond the Zionist, anti-Zionist conversation. Those of us on the panel we're not in our 20s or 30s. We represent a particular age group. We need to acknowledge that. And I think the complications are not just generational for us. This is going to be generational ahead. And we have to pay very close attention and do some serious cheshbon nefesh, some serious collective accounting for how these narratives can be redeemed and what is the change that needs to happen within so that we can be proud of what there is to be proud of and take care of what is shameful.
I vividly remember that moment too when Ohana was sworn in, Amichai. And I also remember not that long afterward hearing Bibi, and I don't remember Ohana too, but I know there were other Likud MKs who were proudly speaking about the country's LGBTQ rights record, and then the next week voted against LGBTQ rights bills in the Knesset and how shameful that was. So in my mind, that is a clear example of pinkwashing. I mean, for me, I always think about what is the intent, what is the impact. So clearly, there, kind of the intent was not to talk about LGBTQ progress in Israel in order to keep advancing it. The intent was to distract from other other actions and policies of the Israeli government. And I think about the impact, or I think about what's the point of departure in a conversation. If a conversation is happening about the injustices of the occupation or the horrors of the war in Gaza, and then someone starts speaking about how much better it is to be gay in Israel than in Gaza, that's another example. And this is the complexity that I think so many of us negotiate and continually navigate, as you were saying, Amichai. At the same time, I've been in countless conversations in which someone in our community will respond to the mention of a gay Israeli singer or a trans artist, or an LGBTQ rights organization in Israel, and just the fact, is condemned and regarded as something that is not worthy of conversation or credibility, and is viewed as pinkwashing. And those are some hard conversations and hard distinctions to fight to make.
Yeah, I want to say just one more thing about that. No, again, I'm back and forth in Israel all the time, like many of us these past months. And one of the things that we're noticing is that the move to the right among younger people does not skip the LGBTQ community. My work with Iggy is showing that even among the queer youth, there is like this growing right-wing populist racist mentality of us and them and binaries and blamings and utter hatred. Now, we're in trauma. This is society in trauma, and there is much to say about it. But the questions that I'm being asked in Jewish queer spaces is the through line, and like reconnecting the through line between what I consider the reason I am who I am is because I came out and because I demanded a seat at the table of the Jewish conversation that is not discriminatory. I demanded to have an inclusive Jewish world where homophobia is a thing of the past. And we talk back to our toxic texts in the same way that I want to be at a table that is completely feminist and is endorsing human rights. And that means some of our old values need to be reimagined. To think that we are here where so many are walking the talk of pride and inclusivity and human rights and human dignity and depriving that of other people because of their race, religion, nationality, across the border, there is a missing link here. And so I think the pinkwashing on a political level is silencing a nuanced and complicated conversation. On a spiritual, socio-cultural conversation, we have so much work to do in this country where bigotry and hatred is on the rise, as we see in the Jewish community and beyond, where we're not connecting the dots. The cliche that if I'm not free, we are not free. That fighting for trans rights and fighting for women's rights and fighting racism equates the human dignity, the human first, that will dictate another way of being in the world and not considering other people across the border as not human. But the dehumanization that we're seeing, the erosion of empathy that we're feeling, is in complete counterbalance to this notion of what we had hoped and still do that pride would do, not just for queer people, but for all people. So that's part of the heartbreak. Yep.
Something that I've been thinking and talking a lot about lately, like, yes, is the erosion of empathy and how devastating that is, but also the politicization of empathy and how, I have experienced numerous times kind of people's faces go steely if I'm speaking about an Israeli's suffering in one context, and then a similar, descending of the stony expression in another context if I speak about Palestinian suffering. And I know that comes from profound pain, and I know that that's what we need to figure out how to address. But I don't know, it's been an aspect of this time that I find particularly crushing.
Yeah, I think that's insightful. Why am I not surprised that this conversation like delves into emotional IQ, like um, emotional quotient? Um, One of the theme lines or through lines that I already picking up in this conversation is on the one hand, uh, I think as Amhai was just talking about, like there's the work that we need to do with our societies, because uh, it is shifting right. Some of that is generational. Um, uh, some of that is work that we haven't finished doing in terms of reimagining our values. Or uh, and then at the same time, uh, there's this distance from the people who we want to be our allies, who are outside of the Jewish community, who are our allies, uh, or who we work together with on other issues in secular spaces, non-Jewish spaces, um, and these are two gaps that we need to work on. Is there well, let me just start with the work that we need to do with the people outside of the Jewish community. Um, are there any lessons that you all have drawn, experiences in doing that work that you think we all can learn from? And maybe, Idit, I'll ask you to go first.
Sure. I wish I could offer, um, you know, a rapid approach to implementing, this kind of bridging of gulfs. I cannot. But what I can say is that I have seen, and others at Keshet have seen time and time again, that taking the time and risking making yourself vulnerable, and having the very painstaking conversations that are necessary to surface everything that needs to be surfaced and work through, and in the best case scenarios, fight your way to understanding that that really, in my experience, is the only way. I have not discovered another way. Pretty soon after October 7th, one of our LGBTQ organizational partners, a major national LGBTQ rights organization, put out a statement about Israel and Gaza that we felt was quite painful and problematic, and had a considerable amount of inaccuracies in terms of how it was talking about history. And so I reached out to the CEO and asked to meet for lunch, and we, I think, said that we each had about an hour and 15 minutes, and that's what we planned to do. Well, 3.5 hours later, and a conversation that at some point, based on a question that she asked me, led me to say, okay, if you want me to answer that question, I have to start in 586 BCE and then move forward, because I really did have to. And it was an extraordinary conversation. I learned a lot. I know she learned a lot. And at the end of the conversation, she said, there's so much more that I understand now, and there's still more that I need to understand. There's certainly more that my team needs to understand. But I am telling you, as the leader of this organization, that you will never see language like that again from us. And we have not. Now, has that happened in every case of every LGBTQ organization or every progressive organization that we experienced using language that was harmful or adding to polarization in really unhelpful ways? No. But when we have taken that deep breath and said, this was really hard for me, can we have a conversation? More often than not, that has led to an important shift.
And that, I mean, it sounds to me, from this experience, that that's also based on a certain amount of trust. and maybe trust that you've earned, maybe a sense that you've had skin in the game on issues? How much do you think that's a factor?
I think it helps enormously. And we have had some experiences with very new relationships. Now, you could say maybe that we, as an organization, had credibility coming into the conversation. I mean, certainly it helps if there's trust in a prior relationship, um, but that hasn't been there in every case. But I think what is there that is the key thing that makes the difference is the willingness to listen and the request to listen from a place of honesty and vulnerability.
Yeah. Amichai, you have.
So I just got back from a week in Berlin where you mentioned Sabbath Queen, Sandy Dubowski's documentary that's featuring my life's work, but really my journey, having come out and have become a drag queen and then a rabbi. It's really a film about the first 2 decades of the 21st century and the progress and the hope and some of the dashed hopes and where we are now. The film started filming. We started filming after 9/11 and finished after October 7th. So there are these bookends of this moment. And we had a screening in Berlin just a few nights ago, and at the end of it, a woman comes over to me and says, "I'm a trans Muslim. I want to bring you to our queer Muslim group here in Berlin. I don't think anyone's met anybody like you. We need to understand the nuance of what you're talking about. Because in the film, I'm saying that I'm standing with the pain of my Israeli family and friends after October 7th and with the pain of the Palestinian people. And this is like really cliche. We're still in the and both. And yes, I think Idit, to your beautiful story and the patience that you both took for 3.5 hours of going back in time and going future forward. For the most case, people don't have the nuance. People don't have the sense of the nuance narrative. And what you see without nuance is a very rigid, hostile story that fits into neat boxes of occupation and colonization and etc. I'm not excusing in any way what's happening, and I do think the Netanyahu government and its implementation in the last year plus has went down the slope of language I won't get into right now. But there are certainly reasons to be furious. But what I'm hearing is like that person came to me and said, I'm a trans Muslim. And then another person said to me and said, I'm Jewish and I'm anti Semitic because of the Netanyahu government. And I looked him in the eye and I said, Dear sir, you choose what you want. But I'm in Berlin. I just arrived here. I'm a child of survivors. I'd like you to listen to what you're saying. You might be anti Zionist. You might be anti Israeli. That's all legit. To say to me that you're anti Semitic means you hate me without even knowing me. Watch your language. Listen to what you're saying. Don't be swept into mass statements that actually need a bit of discernment. So, just two little fragments of the many, many conversations we're all having right now. And I know we're almost out of time, and I know that the 30 plus of us here on the Zoom have questions. And whatever we're here for in the middle of Pride Month, I will just say my approach. Other than showing up with this film and showing up where I teach rabbinically, my Pride Month is not about protests yet again. It's not about Pride marches. It's about finding the intimate places in twos and tens and 20s and for a Shabbat dinner, for a heart circle, for courageous conversation with queer allies and allies from across the board. And that includes people who are completely on the other side of me, pro-Israel or anti-Israel. But perhaps right now, the big umbrella of all colors, all shades, all things, all together now, screaming for fighting supremacy in the streets might not be the safest or the most prudent place for all of us to be proud. I'm saying there's different ways to do this. I'm advocating for the kind of conversations that Idit was just talking about. And I'm advocating that with the privilege of knowing that I'm not out in the streets right now fighting for trans rights and gay rights and human rights and democracy in this country, in Israel and elsewhere. That needs to be done too. But to preserve safety and some kind of nuanced conversation, I'm also advocating for where my comfort zone lies this year, which is less big and more focused, deep, and helpful bridge building between people whose narratives have broken, but whose pride is shared in some way.
Yeah. Thank you. What I love about what's come out in the last several minutes, to me, this feels like the classic tool of the queer movement, and that it can be applied elsewhere too. We have to tell our stories. We have to tell our stories, sometimes again and again and again, and we have to do it with vulnerability, um, so that it's authentic, and we have to do it while we're listening to other stories, um, uh, so that it's authentic. This is, I think, this is what the LGBTQ movement has always done effectively, and has used to drive change. I want to offer that observation, and I want to just take a moment to just pull a couple of the questions that we haven't gotten to yet, and sort of maybe go around one last time for any final thoughts. And if you have anything to say about these questions, please do so. The first was a question about how we manage grief of friendships that we've lost for people who are not willing to notice anti-Semitism. Although I would add to it, I think that same question can be applied to other issues. The grief for the friendship for the people who are not willing to see who we are and what we're suffering with. That's my editorializing. And there was another question specifically about the Dyke March, and the pushback to the notion that it should be opened to Zionists, and if there's anything, particularly in that space, that could or should be done. And then this is not a question, but there was also somebody put in the Q&A the link to the ACLU action responding to the Scrimeti decision. I'll put that in the chat so that everybody has that link the moment this conversation ends. So let's go around. Any thoughts on those questions or anything else you want to leave us with? Idit, we can start with you.
So for better or for worse, I tend to be extremely persistent about a lot of things. And so there probably are some friendships that I should have let go of, but I haven't. I have really fought for the people who matter to me. Sometimes I've fought kind of as a matter of principle, like I shouldn't lose this friendship over this, and so I won't. So that isn't an experience I've had. There's certainly people who were more tangentially in my life who, because of anti-Semitism, because of what I experienced as a dehumanizing way, they were relating to Israelis or to Israeli suffering, that I have kind of let go from my life. And that has felt necessary for my, just emotional health. And to whomever asked that question, I'd be glad to talk directly about that more. And I've certainly heard a lot of stories from friends and colleagues about that dynamic. In terms of the Dyke March, I know that there. I'm not personally involved with that, nor is anyone from Keshet kind of in leadership there, or involved in organizing efforts against the leadership. But we do know and are connected with people who are trying to organize and build, the, of course, large number of people who do not disagree, who do not agree with that policy and with that decision, which has been sort of foisted upon the Dyke March, my understanding is, by a quite small group of people. So I think it's a longer term campaign for those for whom it matters, unfortunately. I know that it's been something very painful for a lot of women and trans and non-binary people in New York, for whom that Jews, for whom that has been their political home, and of course, I hope that we are able to lead to a shift moving forward. And since I think we're closing now, I'll just say that I return again and again when I think of pride and when I think of the LGBTQ liberation movement more broadly. I return again and again to love, because love is why this whole thing started. You know, our right, our freedom, you know, to love whom we wish, our right, our freedom to exuberantly love ourselves, you know, in all of our gloriousness, and to expect that the world see that and love us. And so for me, I find it really helpful, particularly when on very painful days, to remember that ultimately that's what this movement is about. And that's what we need to lift up and build and strengthen and give voice to, because that is how, you know, we will be able to move forward and thrive.
I'll continue your line of thought and feeling, Idit. Love is love, and I'm here, you're here, we're here because we believe that love is a birthright, and we are in the first century of a historic shift in how love is celebrated. And we're in the first century of the historic shift in how Jewish life is celebrated. And a lot of these shifts are converging and right now stepping on each other's toes. So the relay race that we are in the middle of is middle management, um, age-wise, is the transfer of power, and we are going to be part of a generations-long healing process from what is happening right now to make sure we do walk the talk of these converging prides and loves that are intersectional at core and that remind us human first alongside all our other identities. For me, the other side of pride is not shame but humility, and the humility of being human and the responsibility that comes with that. So whatever happens this Pride Month, with all the healing we need to be aware of and helpful with, I got my eyes on the prize of the next generation and how we can make sure that we keep conversations like this and others as helpful as possible in finding the messy middle from which we grow.
I love that. Um, I love that a lot. It actually makes me think I should have opened with something like that and uh, borrow it for next time. Uh, but the right, it you know, I think it is who NJN is trying to be organizationally. If I could put a plug in for my own organization, right? We have old narratives um, that were very binary and haven't worked. And we need to write a different narrative, a new narrative um, that meets where we are now and what the future needs in order to build on the work that's been done up to now. Um, I want to thank you both. I could not have dreamed of a more nuanced, thoughtful, real conversation. I'm only sorry we had to do it at a time like this when all of us are distracted and sort of heart torn by what's happening all around us. Um, but thank you very, very much for being a part of this.
Thank you, Noam.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Amichai.
Thank you, Idit. Thank you all. Here's to better days. Yehi Shalom.
Amen. Shalom.
Chag Sameach.
Bye.